As we continue our Lenten study of the Gospel story, it behooves us to take a look at how the Gospels, the books about Jesus, came to be. That story is far more complicated than most people realize. For instance, the Gospels themselves were not written by people who were eyewitnesses to the ministry of Jesus. They came a full generation later. The earliest of the Gospels, so far as we can determine, is the Gospel according to Mark. It's also the shortest of the Gospels. The Gospel according to Mark was written somewhere between 65 and 70 AD, a good 30 years after Jesus' life. And contrary to what many people assume, Mark was not an eyewitness to these events. In fact, we're not sure who Mark was. Nothing in the Gospel provides a name for the author of the book. That was attached later. It is believed, or was believed, that it was written by a man named John Mark, who basically served as the Apostle Peter's secretary when he was preaching in Rome. The story goes that John Mark was writing down these stories as Peter would tell them in his preaching and teaching, just in his sharing of remembrances. And later, John Mark compiled all these stories, edited them together, and created the gospel. A gospel which would go on, in fact, to serve as the base material for the gospels of Matthew and Luke as well. Fully 40% of each of those gospels is made up of material that was taken directly from Mark. That's how we come to know that Mark preceded them and is the oldest of the four gospels. Actually, this gospel was written at a time when the church was undergoing great persecution, being violently suppressed by the regime of the Emperor Nero. And many of those original witnesses, the people who did know Jesus personally, were dying off, either because of old age or because they were being slaughtered. And it became incumbent to write these stories down so that there would be a long-lasting record. I doubt that the author of these Gospels had any idea the record would last this long, but it's a good thing they went about preserving it. They did it by taking, in large part, oral stories, what we call the oral tradition, stories that have been passed down decade after decade. Now, we moderns tend to be skeptical about what's called the oral tradition. We think it couldn't possibly be accurate. It couldn't possibly retain accurate information over that amount of time, passing through that many mouths, if you will. But that's a bias that's based on our own experience in a modern time, in which we're far more familiar with having stuff written down, recorded on paper, on video, any number of ways. We've become pretty lousy at memorizing stuff. We count on written records to do that for us. In fact, we are so awash in information that mostly what we find ourselves simply trying to remember is the way to access information, to look it up later. We learn to Google and to do other things to source the information we're looking for. But in Jesus' time, there was a lot less information flooding at you, and the primary way, sometimes really the only way, that important information came to you and was retained by the community was orally, by hearing and remembering stories with accuracy. Now, again, we think that's hard to do, We don't believe others can do it as a result. That's kind of modern arrogance. The truth is that if that is your sole means of communicating important information, important history, people can memorize stuff at a prodigious level if it's important to them. And this was very important. You may remember the book Roots by Alex Haley, an African American writer who decided to trace back his roots to Africa. In order to do so, he took what little information he had about the ancestor who had first been brought as a slave to America in the mid 1700s, a young man named Kunta Kinte. He knew his ancestor's name, that he lived along a river called the Cambe-Balongo, and a couple words in the native language. That was all he had to go on. But using modern study techniques and sociological histories, he was able to eventually trace Kunta Kinte's home area back to Ghana into Africa and to a village named after his family. He traveled to the village to see if there was any sort of history available that might confirm that this was where his family originated. He discovered there was no written record, but that the tribe had a storyteller, had a historian, who had memorized generation after generation after generation of the tribe's history, names, dates, places, events. He went to the village that the Kintes came from and found one of these storytellers, one of these historians. They were called griots. And he asked the man about Kunta Kinte, and it was explained to him that he could only tell the story from beginning to end. He couldn't just jump in at any one spot. He had been taught to memorize this whole tribal history, and he had to repeat and recite the whole history to get to any one point in it. And so he began. He wasn't sure exactly what year the man began with, but it was long in the past. And he had been going on and on and on in great detail for hours, when suddenly, in his long recitation, he declared the young man named Kunta Kinte went out from the village to look for a gourd he was going to use to make into a musical instrument, and he disappeared. This was the Kunta Kinte who was kidnapped by slavers and taken to America, his great, 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 great grandfather. And that had happened in the mid 1700s. This man had gone on for hours prior to that. And he'd only gotten to a point where he was in the mid 1700s after doing so. He memorized this entire tribal history. There are stories of other people engaging in enormous acts of memorization. A Muslim man in Turkey who memorized the entire Quran, which is about the size of the Christian Bible. And he memorized it with accuracy. Human beings can transmit information by memory with great accuracy if that is what they are taught and trained to do and what they're used to doing. So there's reason to believe that the stories contained in the Gospels are accurate, even though they were transmitted for the first 3 decades orally. Mark was the first, gathered those stories together, would form the entirety of the first Gospel, Mark's Gospel, and would form close to 40% of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Biblical scholars have noted that another 25% of the material that is in both the Gospels of Matthew and Luke is identical, though not from Mark. These are sayings of Jesus. They're not descriptions of events, of things he did, just strictly sayings. And these sayings are pretty much word for word identical, which indicates that Matthew and Luke had access to another written source that they both used. That source has, in its original form, been lost to us. But biblical scholars have deduced that it existed, and that these other writers made use of it and saw it as authoritative. A German biblical scholar was the first to come up with this theory, and so he named this unnamed source Q, which stands for Quelle, which is the German word for source. Between Mark and Q, you find most of the information that is in all three of the first Gospels. But Matthew and Luke have some material that is unique to them. For instance, Matthew's 25th chapter, which talks about the last judgment. As you have done to the least of these, you've done to me. That's unique to Matthew. The story of the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, which are found in the Gospel according to Luke, are stories that are unique to Luke. They also had some sources of their own. We don't know who they were, but Matthew and Luke found them credible. As long as I'm at it, I should note that we don't know who wrote the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Those names were attached to them later as well. One question that arises is, why are there 4 Gospels? Why is the Gospel of John so different from the other 3? Well, those are questions for another time, but I hope this provides you with some background, and that if you have any questions, feel free to submit them here under the YouTube comment section, or ask me at church. Better yet, join us in our online Lenten studies. We'll be having one this Wednesday at 6:30 on Zoom, and we'll provide information on how you can access that if you wish. I'm available to you anytime, in the cyber world or in the real world, because no matter where we are, God is.